Good morning. I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Wednesday, July 16th. Now, I'm just going to start briefly on a meeting that occurred in Beijing yesterday between Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was also in attendance. Now, clearly there was a lot more discussed at this meeting, but as the Russian Foreign Ministry reported, it was to discuss preparations for Russian President Vladimir Putin's upcoming visit to China, where he will attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit and celebrations marking the 80th anniversary of the victory over militaristic Japan. So that obviously was going to be occurring later this summer, September, I believe. But I think just as a reflection that, here we are 80 years after the defeat of the fascist scourge and the militarism in Japan, the axis that was powers that were at that point, that here we are on the verge of dangerous escalations, as the reports came in yesterday about the idea of long-range missiles being provided to Ukraine to be used against Russia. Now, I'll come back to that because there's somewhat of a battle around that in terms of what the intention of the Trump administration is. But I think just as a reflection point of what could have been the crisis at that point, what could have been an opportunity, that, we had the victory over Japan, which will be celebrated later this summer. Of course, China bore the brunt of that, 15 to 20 million deaths in that war, as was the case similarly with Russia bearing the brunt of the war in the European theater. Some estimates go as high as 30 million lost during that war. But, the peace that was secured over Japan was identical to the peace that was agreed upon before the bombs were actually dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And there's a lot of historical evidence coming out that shows that indeed this was true and that those bombs were absolutely unnecessary. What they were necessary for, and what the British imperial forces convinced Truman to launch them for, or to drop those bombs for, was to usher in a new phase of the British Empire, which had seen that much of the world was rejecting its colonial models. And in fact, Franklin D. Roosevelt intended that after the war, as he said, as recounted by his son Elliot Roosevelt, we did not fight a war against fascist economic slavery so that the British imperial policy could continue. And that was to be the intent. Following the end of World War II, we would have collaborated with the very same forces in the Soviet Union and China that we worked with to defeat the forces of fascism. The intention by Roosevelt was that those would be our collaborators for a new era of decolonialization. Now, that did not happen. Instead, following the dropping of the bombs, we had the Iron Curtain lowered. That was, of course, announced in the speech by Winston Churchill barely a year after Roosevelt's death. And instead, we turned against the allies that we had during World War II, and the world was ruled under the fear of nuclear weapons. And in addition to the Iron Curtain being lowered, there was essentially in the new phase of the British Empire being operated through the empires of the mind, as Churchill called it. This was the psychological warfare, narrative construction, all of the aspects of propaganda that we see, which has now brought us out of the Cold War and into a new phase of a potential hot war. So this is where we're at, and I think just an indication of the propagandists pushing for further escalation, I come to yesterday's Financial Times article, which is entitled, "Donald Trump asked Volodymyr Zelensky if Ukraine could hit Moscow. Say people briefed on the call." So this apparently was in the July 4th phone call with Vladimir Zelensky. Donald Trump apparently, according to the Financial Times, he essentially urged Zelensky to use missiles to strike far into Russia. Now, that's obviously in the context of what the announcement on Monday that Trump made concerning the supply of weapons to Ukraine, which there's certainly some confusion about what that actually means and how that, what the mechanics of that are. I'll come to that in a minute. But apparently, some of the discussions that were reported in the Financial Times and subsequently in the Washington Post by none other than David Ignatius, a longtime mouthpiece of the Anglo-American intelligence crowd. Ignatius' article was entitled "That Trump Intends to Escalate to De-Escalate," meaning escalate on against Russia to somehow calm down the situation. But in the context of all this, there was a discussion of what kind of long-range weapons would be supplied. Supposedly, there was a discussion in the Trump administration that perhaps Tomahawks could be provided, which of course is extremely dangerous because the Russians do not know if there are conventional warheads or nuclear warheads. So if they see a Tomahawk coming their way, they don't know the answer to that question of whether they're nuclear armed or not. Now, the Financial Times said that two people familiar with the conversation between Trump and Zelensky said the U.S. president had asked his Ukrainian counterpart whether he could hit military targets deep inside Russia if he provided weapons capable of doing so. It goes on with supposed quotes from this discussion where Trump says, "Volodymyr, can you hit Moscow? Can you hit St. Petersburg too?" And apparently Zelensky replied, "Absolutely, we can if you give us the weapons." So did this cartoonish conversation actually take place? Is this psychological warfare tactics by the British to accelerate the proxy war in Ukraine, which is, on the verge of being lost? We don't know the answer to these questions, given the source. That it is British intelligence laundered through the Financial Times. However, what Trump did say on these matters yesterday, as well as the White House, he kicked back on some of these questions. And on his way to Pittsburgh, Trump told reporters, "No, we're not looking to do that," responding to the question of long-range missiles or striking targets inside of Russia. And then apparently on Zelensky, he said, no, he shouldn't target Moscow. He went on to say, "I'm on nobody's side. You know whose side I'm on, humanity's side." So that's Trump's view on the matter. Certainly actions indicate that he's not exactly the passive observer that he might wish to claim he is. But okay. So anyway, now Carolyn Levitt also responded to these media reports, basically saying that the Financial Times is notorious for taking words out of context to get clicks because their paper is dying. All right, now, whatever the particulars of that call actually were, it is certainly clear that the British crowd intends to escalate things. Now, concerning the actual nature of the battle, I think there's something that came from Mark Rutte. He of course just had the discussion with Trump. This is the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who just had the discussion on Monday with Donald Trump on the whole issue of arms being supplied to Ukraine. And, there's a lot of ambiguity about what's actually going on here. Is this NATO buying weapons? If that's the case, isn't the United States a part of NATO? Or is this just supposed to be the European elements of NATO? If so, those, individual states of Europe can already buy weapons from the United States and supply them, I suppose, to whoever they want, or at least to Ukraine. But if the U.S., or if it is NATO, given that the U.S. is a part of NATO, Alexander Mercurius of the Duran asked this question yesterday. He said, wouldn't this would essentially be a form of the United States taking money from one pocket and putting it in the other? In other words, funding NATO, which in turn uses our money to buy the weapons. Now, there are protests coming from European leaders, if you can call them that, indicating that perhaps this is intended to be the Europeans buying these weapons. The foreign policy chief of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, she's welcomed Trump's announcement, but said that Brussels would like to see the U.S. share the burden. If we pay for these weapons, it's our support, it's European support, Kaja said. She said that, we are doing as much as we can to help Ukraine, and therefore the call is that everybody would do the same. It's, if you promise to give weapons but say that somebody else is going to pay, it's not really given by you, is it? So, we'll have to follow where this goes in terms of who's actually buying the weapons. Is this an attempt by Trump to somewhat distance himself, tell the Europeans, you want the war to continue, you pay for the weapons? Well, of course, the military-industrial complex will be happy to supply them if we even have them. It's unclear what's actually going on. The other part of this is Trump's warnings around the 50 days to get the war resolved, or peace, negotiations going. Otherwise, there's going to be the secondary sanctions. Now, on those, I think, just to be clear, what we have known, in terms of the LaRouche organization, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been clear that this entire war is targeting the BRICS. And Mark Rutte sort of clarified the aims on these sanctions, where he told Bloomberg, I'm not sure if this was immediately following it was following, but I don't know if it's immediately following the meeting with Donald Trump. But what he told Bloomberg was, Mark Rutte, my encouragement to these three countries, particularly, is if you now live in Beijing or in Delhi, or you're the president of Brazil, you might want to take a look into this, because this might hit you very hard. So please make the phone call to Vladimir Putin and tell him that he has got to get serious about peace talks, because otherwise this will slam back on Brazil, on India, and on China in a massive way. So, of course, those are some of the leading nations of the BRICS. And I think also indicating the same target, that this is indeed the BRICS. On an X post on Monday, Senator Blumenthal, who of course is the architect along with Lindsey Graham of the 500% bone-crushing sanctions, he said in this X post, we'll continue to push for Senator Graham and my Russia sanctions bill with even tougher penalties to deter India, China, Brazil, and others from fueling Putin's war machine. So, look, all of this is out of desperation that the proxy war is being lost, which has massive implications for the existence of NATO, its viability as any sort of global power. And so I think, this desperation is at the core of this escalation. It is up to us to lead the discussion internationally to say that this hegemonic worldview of taking on Russia with somehow talks of moving on, maybe withdrawing from Russia to the Ukraine proxy war to move on towards China, which of course is 10 times the population of Russia and the leading industrial power on the planet. So how they're going to do that, given their failures in the proxy war in Ukraine, good luck with that. But anyway, our role is to say that this hegemonic view, we have to give it up. This is not in the tradition of the United States. We should be collaborating with the BRICS dynamic, just as Roosevelt intended to collaborate with the nations, our allies, in defeating the fascists in World War II. We could have allied with them to end the British colonial system, and that is what is needed to do. We need to do today. Now, just briefly, apparently Peskov said today that the Russian side is calling on all partners to pressure Kiev into holding a next round of direct talks with Moscow. So we'll follow that through the course of the day. But otherwise, tune in to Helga Tseplarusha's webcast today. That will be moderated by the president of the LaRouche organization, Diane Sayre. The webcast is entitled World War III or a New International Security Architecture, and Helga will address a number of these matters. So you can tune into that on the schillerinstitute.com or find links on the LaRouche organization site. So stay tuned to the LaRouche organization, tune into the webcast, and we'll see you